Hello. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Everybody can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm really honored to be speaking here at the Portland Art Museum. I have a personal history with this museum that I'm going to talk about in just a minute, but I just love museums in general, and I love art history, and it's a real thrill for me to be here in a museum and in this specific museum, given this opportunity to speak. So I'd like to thank the museum for giving me this opportunity. And this is going to be a pretty straightforward talk. I am a painter, if you're not familiar with my work. And my own work is super engaged with art history, and I sort of considered like maybe some slightly performative things I could do, but that's not my jam at all. So this is just going to be me talking about two paintings in particular, and my thoughts about those paintings, some of my personal reactions to those paintings, and connections of these paintings to my own practice as well. So, and I have my little notes here that I'll be referring to a little bit. So, as I said, I have a history with this museum. I am a Portland native. I was born and raised in Southeast Portland, and I was fortunate enough I went to public school, and I had a wonderful third grade teacher who was really passionate about art history, and she started bringing us to the museum. So I started interacting with the museum when I was in third grade, which is 8. And so art history, I had definitely an affinity for art from a very young age. And I also was allowed to develop this affinity with the museum from a very young age, which I think is a really, it's been a huge influence on my work. And it's not that common of an experience. I don't think people see art history as something removed, not part of their daily life, and that was not my experience, and I feel very fortunate in that. I also actually was part of a program to be a junior docent when I was a little bit older in 4th and 5th grade, and I have a photograph here that I'll pass around in front of the Bierstadt painting, the very well-known painting of Mount Hood that's in the collection. My mom pulled that out of the album this morning. Thanks, Mom. And like I said, my work embraces art history in a critical, I endeavor to embrace art history, and specifically the history of painting, in a critical relationship, so not one where I'm simply just assuming it into my visual language and practice, but one where I look and think and take things in, and then engage in a process of perhaps deconstruction or analyzation, looking to understand not only what the images may mean to me in my practice, but maybe what they could mean socially, politically, both at the time that they were made and also the time that I find myself looking now. And actually, there's a painting that I made in the last couple years, and it's titled "Not to Pass on Tradition, but to Break Its Hold Over Us." And that's actually a quote from Adrienne Rich, who's a feminist writer and thinker and poet from an essay called When We Dead Awaken. And that title, not to pass on tradition, but to break its hold over us, I think that term, the word pass can be taken two ways. So not to pass on tradition, not to pass it on, like just give it thoughtlessly, but maybe give it with intentionality. So that's one way I read it. And also not to pass on, like to pass over. So not to disregard history, but take it as something that's part of heritage, part of our cultural heritage, maybe part of my own personal heritage, or maybe not part of my own personal heritage. But either way, to look at things, to look at history, and specifically art history, with intentionality, and try to understand and deconstruct what's happening there. Okay, so that being said, here we are in front of this painting. So go back in time a little bit. I originally was scheduled to do this talk, actually, I think it was, maybe Betsy, you can correct me, I think it was the 8th of January. Yeah, so I came to the museum to research what I was going to talk about, sometime before Christmas, and I knew that I wanted to be, I just intuitively was operating on some different ground rules. I knew I wanted to be in these old, the galleries that are original to the Portland Art Museum building, because these are the galleries that I occupied when I was young and interacting with the museum, and so it felt important to me to be in these galleries. And one thing that another ground rule that I have for myself when I am in a museum is to really follow my own pleasure in looking. I'm very aware in the museum we've all experienced it, it's so easy to get so tired in a museum. I think part of it is the often marble floors, which I'm glad that we're standing on wood floors right now. But there is an exhaustion that happens with the organization of space and the conceptual organization of most institutions, where things are grouped mostly by era. And I totally understand why that happens. I'm not knocking the institution. But I think that it casts the pall of sameness over everything and doesn't allow us to see or experience sometimes the specificities of different moments that are present. So when I go into a museum, I try really hard to allow myself, for lack of a better word, to be very fickle, and just, if something calls to me, to follow that and listen to that. And so I was wandering the galleries, and this piece here really grabbed me. And this was not a piece that I have experience with at the museum. I don't know if it's a recent addition, but I had not encountered it hanging before. I'll just say the title if you're not familiar with the piece. It's called Nature's Fan, and another title I found online, although it's not listed here on the wall, is Girl with a Child. And it's by William-Adolphe Bouguereau, who was a French neoclassical painter. It was painted in 1881, and Bouguereau was born just to give you an idea of his lifespan, he was born in 1825, and he died in 1905, so basically the 19th century. So I came upon this Bouguereau, and it really grabbed me, and I wasn't expecting that. And I'm gonna talk about that experience, sort of my emotional experience to the painting in a moment, but I wanna talk about a few things first. So I mentioned that my own work partakes of art history, and one of the ways that it does that is my own work is very involved with representation of the female body and how the female body has been, is the primary subject of the history of Western painting, and the often naked female body. And I seek to sometimes recontextualize those bodies, sometimes critique the way that those bodies have been represented, sometimes critique social institutions that mandate bodies be represented in certain ways. And so one of the things I do is I often borrow bodies from other paintings and use them in my own paintings. For example, a painting that you may be familiar with, Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe. There's, of course, the two male figures and the two female figures. There's one female figure far in the distance and one in the front, and she's almost the most forward figure in the painting, and her side is turned to us, and one of her knees is up, and her hand is on her knee, and she's sort of looking out, kind of aspatially towards the audience. I've used that figure in multiple paintings. And so I have used Bouguereau's figures in some of my paintings. And before I started borrowing figures from Bouguereau, I wouldn't have given his work a second glance, really. There was a time in my life where neoclassical painting was like, like red shag carpet or something. It was just like the last thing I ever want to see. I mean, worse than red shag carpet, like I don't know what, like something awful, like a perm. It'd be like giving myself a perm or something, although I have a perm in that picture. But some things, I'd say a number of years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, started to shift in my practice where technique started to become much more important to me. And my technique is not this, but it is a very, I would say it's a close and a very specific and intentional and thoughtful relationship to the materials that I use. And that also was reinforced by starting to teach, and specifically at Oregon College of Art and Craft, where I do most of my teaching. And you'll notice the word craft in the name. They really, truly do focus a lot on craft, which I think is such an underdeveloped aspect of painting in the postmodern field of painting. And it's sort of, like painting's redheaded stepchild. And so, my training as a postmodern painter, I got the message that craft isn't that cool, and representation, could be cool, but you have to be very ironic or tongue-in-cheek about it, and definitely not romantic. So there was a point in time when I wouldn't have given a Bouguereau a second thought, but starting to engage with his paintings in my own studio, and my development in terms of my own craft with my work started to open my eyes toward his work. And a number of years ago, I was in the Met, and I remember being completely blown away by a number of Bouguereaus that they have there, and really started to consider my own prejudices towards neoclassicism and the role of craft, and especially like extremely highly developed craft in painting. So I went off script here for a little bit. So this painting really grabbed me for a number of different reasons, and not the least of which is some really interesting things I think that are happening in terms of the content of the painting, which I'm also going to delve into in a minute. But I would say that, to go back to what I alluded to about my emotional experience when I first saw this painting, the word that kept coming to me was reverie. And I can recall it a little bit now. The sense of something kind of engulfing me when I approached the work that drew me kind of magnetically towards it. And when that happens, that's something that I really pay attention to, because it's a special thing that doesn't always happen, and it's sort of like a moment out of time, a moment of grace. And I think partly that response has to do some with my own connection to the artist and my own practice. Also, I think it has to do with the scale, which is of a size that as you approach the piece, if you get close enough and the guards don't yell at you, that it kind of, you're sort of engulfed by it a little bit, like your peripheral vision is sort of filled with the piece. And then there's the subject matter, which on the surface is one of quietude, of pleasure, of a still moment, of a potentially tender exchange between an older female and a younger child, although I'm also going to talk about their relationship and break that down a little bit. So that sense of reverie and the sort of what's depicted, the subject of the painting, I think also created for me a sense of desire to like be in this beautiful space, this still space outside, warm, hopefully. And it was winter, and that, maybe was playing into it as well. So I decided I was going to talk about this piece, and then I left to go to New York to see the Kerry James Marshall show at the Met, and I came back to like 3 feet, and I mean, it wasn't 3 feet, but like 2 feet, 10 inches of snow in Portland. And the museum, I think I got back a day late, so it was the day before the talk. And I was totally unprepared, because I thought I would prepare when I was in New York, and my 3.5-year-old kept me from sleeping the entire time. And so I was super frazzled, and then the museum was closed on the 8th, and so there was no talk. And so that was January, and then I rescheduled with Betsy, and a couple weeks ago, I came back to the museum. Actually, it was just last week. It was after the Mickalene Thomas talk, and I came back to these galleries, and I was hoping that I would still have the same feeling towards this painting, and I didn't. I remember the feeling that I have, and that feeling is really important to me, but it didn't sort of reach out from the wall and like grab me and pull me towards it again. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. What do I do with that? What can I do with that? I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. What I did with that will become clear momentarily, but I want to talk for a minute before I talk about sort of what happened next, I want to go back to talking about the content of this piece a little bit. So the reverie might draw to the painting, but that in itself is not enough for me. I am also looking for something that rubs in a certain way, like just beauty. Pleasure is super important. I think pleasure is super important in terms of looking, and I think pleasure, maybe as it is aligned with beauty, doesn't get the credit that it is due. People are very afraid, especially in terms of discourse and conceptual discourse, very, very afraid to talk about beauty and very afraid to talk about pleasure because, I don't know, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, so beauty and pleasure, or I will say pleasure is very important to me, but there also has to be something else, something like chewy or nutty, like some salt on the caramel or something, or a sour pickle. And as I sat with this piece, some things started to arise that struck me that were strange and maybe disquieting. And those are very interesting to me, and I think very productive for my own practice. And so what are those things? Well, I think that this is a little bit of an odd pair. She's not, just going off my read of this painting, I didn't want to do a bunch of research about what other people had thought about this painting or anything like that, but just my own, because I think like our own reads of paintings are very important to pay attention to, and not to sort of displace our authority onto, an art historian or someone else. So my own read of this is that she's not the mother, and then come to find out, the sort of subtitle is girl with a child. So she's not the mother, and she doesn't quite seem like a sibling, like they're so far apart in age. So then she sort of kind of appears to me as a servant that is there to mind the child. And I guess I'm reading that from her clothing, which seems a little bit, kind of grubby. And also, the child is relaxed, and she is entertaining the child, which anyone who has a child knows that children often need to be entertained. But there seems to be, I just read a power differential between these two, whereas she seems to be in service to this child. And whether she's a servant or not, I think I'm a mom, and sometimes, like a lot of the time, I feel like a servant. So that's not exactly my job description, but that's like where the rubber hits the road. So if she truly is a servant, then there's labor here that is unacknowledged. And even if she's a mom, there's labor that's unacknowledged, right? Because the labor of mothering and more generally parenting, not to exclude dads who parent, but moms, because of breastfeeding and things like that, often end up being the primary parent. So I feel okay saying mothering is often unacknowledged labor. So whether she's a mother or a servant or a sister, there's unacknowledged labor happening here, because it's not about what she's doing for this child. It's about this sort of bucolic scene. So that's an interesting sort of oddity, I think, that isn't, I don't think was part of Bouguereau's intention. And then another thing that sort of arises for me is the nudity of the child. And the child is more or less the focal point. What's happening right here is where the light is falling, and it's where the lines of composition are leading us to look. And, you know, somewhat the gaze between the two, but really she's gazing at the child, and the child is sort of like in the, you know, their own experience. So, so this nude child is the focal point of this painting. And I, like I said, I'm a mom. I have a 3-year-old kid who runs like a naked, you know, wild little being around my world, and I'm fine with that. Like, it's not nudity that, or nakedness that I think is problematic. I think it's the way that the child is positioned in this painting that makes it problematic. And what I mean by that is the child is unclothed, but because of their position is hiding their genitalia, or the, you know, and the chest. There's a little bit of a nipple you can see. And so with the arms and legs, the child is clothing him or herself. And that position is very tenuous, like it could move and be exposed in any moment. Now, there's a great essay by a man named Mario Perinola called Between Clothing and Nudity, where he talks about it being the movement from being dressed to being naked, that like it's that, what he calls the transit, the change, and that's where the erotic actually arises. Like, if we're naked, you're just naked. And I don't know if you've ever been to like a hot springs, but it's like totally mundane, people sort of just walking around, you know, all of their bits hanging out, and it's no big deal. But there's something about the act of unclothing that then allows the erotic to arise. And so I see this child as, in a way, clothed, but at any moment could be exposed. So I think that there is, for me, there's an element of the erotic that is contained within the gesture of this child, which I think is a very interesting and unintended aspect of this painting, and something that I find the unintended, potentially problematic thing, I think, is productive. So there's that. And then also, finally, the landscape itself. I keep finding myself, when I was spending more time with this painting, wanting to know more about where they are, and there's no way to penetrate the space. It's totally like the only specificity we're given is in a little bit of the plants in the front, which may be, I'm forgetting there's a dandelion right here, and this tree right here, and the leaf that she's holding, and the rest of it is like a theatrical set, like it's like very two-dimensional. And the thing that is important in this naturescape is the people, and the landscape exists merely as a backdrop for those people. And I think that idea of humans being like of primary importance in our world to the total like sort of occlusion of all the life and all the specificity and all the diversity around us is a very dangerous proposition that's gotten us into a pretty deep hole. So those are some of the sort of problematic things that arose for me as I was sitting with this painting. So, like I mentioned, last week I came back.
Can I ask you a question? Was that your realization the first time you saw it, or the second time you saw it? The tension in these observations you just talked about, was it the first time, or?
There was a big lapse between, so probably the first time I saw this painting was around Christmas, and the second time was a week ago. And in that time, the painting would arise in my mind, and I would think about my talk and what am I going to talk about, and I'd think about the painting, and it sort of continued to live on in my imagination and in my thought process. And so those realizations arose over that time. Yeah, and I'd say crystallized as I was writing to prepare for this talk, which is often how I sort of crystallize my thoughts, is by writing about them. But yeah, it happened sort of a long, slow build. Yeah. Okay, so yes, so I came back last week and the painting and I weren't agog with each other anymore. And I'm like, oh crap, what am I gonna do? And obviously, like, there's a lot for me to talk about, but I also think it's really important to acknowledge that that the viewing experience is one, I feel very strongly the viewing experience is one that's alive, and I just want to promote that. So I wanted to acknowledge the fact that this painting wasn't as alive for me, and so I went looking for other paintings maybe that were. Yeah, so I actually would like to lead you on a little walk.
So, question. So when you say alive, like, how are you expressing that in terms of alive in the sense that you feel it's vibrant, or alive, or not alive in the sense that you said is a little disconcerting?
Oh, definitely the former. Disconcerting doesn't bother me at all in terms of, but it's that former sense of kind of magnetic draw that I talked about that I wasn't experiencing. And that could, I mean, I don't know where that comes from and where it goes. It could be that I experienced that the first time because I'd never seen the painting before and I was surprised by it. But I think that, you know, we approach paintings differently every time because we're different in a different mindset, in a different emotional state, in a different psychological state, and so they're going to appear different to us. And they change over time, like that, because of like the machinations of my thoughts, what I was seeing when I looked at the painting was different between December and last week.
Do you think the artist, like, so on first glance, like much like when you try to deconstruct, like you said, in your own work with female image and light, when you first look at it and you don't give it as much thought, it almost looks like pleasant and almost appealing and peaceful and stuff. But then actually, if you study it more, you start to see the disconcerting elements of it, like her stare, right? Like, it doesn't seem like a warm expression.
No, it doesn't, no.
At all. And you can also see kind of like the sternness of the arm, right? There's no softness there either. So I mean, as you study it, you start to get impressions of it that actually don't make it as comfortable or soft, right? Do you think that as you look at that as an artist, that's an intentional play by the artist? Or in neoclassicism, was the artist, you think, actually kind of, playing with that idea of on the surface it being soft, but then also having those other elements of, class?
That's a great question. I know that Bouguereau was very committed to neoclassicism. So I would need to do a lot of research into his, history and any writings that he had done to be able to begin to answer that question. But I think that, my projection is that he would believe himself to be presenting, I don't know, I'm just about to call him naive and I don't want to do that. I was going to say, I think he's presenting, a pastoral scene of pleasure, and that his own, psychology comes through that. Because I know that he had affairs with some of his models, and no person, I think, has an absolutely perfect relationship to their own childhood or their own caregivers growing up, or, you know, on and on and on. So I can't answer that question. It's a great question. But I know that Bouguereau was really committed to the project of neoclassicism, which was in opposition to, you know, Impressionism that was ascendant in the late 19th century, all about, you know, questioning everything that had come before and questioning the role of painting and questioning the role of representation. Neoclassicism was ultra committed to representation in its most pure form and its classical, you know, iteration and everything. So So irony and.
Another question on that. So in your work, you do a lot with geometric design. Were you drawn to this picture also because of kind of the geometric? I mean, the triangle of the middle is so strong to me anyway in this picture of how it really is a clear triangle of the painting.
Not consciously, but I mean, back to your other question, I think that's one of the things that continually fascinates me about painting is how we can't help but bring all of ourselves to bear as artists and as viewers, you know, like, so even if Bouguereau was utterly committed to sort of classicism in its most pure form, there's no way to separate himself from himself and to paint only about ideals without the, you know, the vagaries of his daily life and experience as a human being entering into it. And we as viewers project those things onto this as well. I mean, I think it's, you know, somebody else may see this expression, which is very vague, and project something else into that expression. You know, somebody may see the gesture of that arm and project something else into that, like a protective or, you know, fortitude or something like that. So yeah, we bring all of ourselves to bear on work as we're looking at it and as we're making it. Yeah, thanks. Thank you for indulging me. Perhaps you can intuit some of my junior docent rising to the surface and leading you around the museum. I would do it for another hour if I could. So here is where we end up. This is a painting by a painter named Morris Graves, and it is called, it's a long title, Memorial Day Wildflower Bouquet in the Cemetery of an Abandoned Western Mining Town, which has sort of a poetic lilt to it. It was painted in 1936. And this actually was a top contender in my original consideration of what I was going to talk about. And I found myself last week back here again. And so I realized that what I wanted to do was also talk about this painting, talk about some of the relationships that I saw between the two paintings. And also, I have to admit that I am definitely influenced by a class I co-taught, an MFA class I co-taught this last semester at OCAC, where the other professor and I had our students consider two pieces at the art museum and as sort of a bookends and what happens in the space between those two pieces, which I think is a fascinating exercise to do, and kind of takes me back to thinking, I mean, it definitely takes me back to thinking about the museum and the institution. Sort of my fantasy is to, I mean, I fantasize about becoming famous just because I want to be famous, but I'd like to be famous so that I can curate a space in an institution. And I mean, Fred Wilson's work, Mining the Museum, if you haven't seen it, is an incredible piece that I'm not going to attempt to sort of deconstruct now, but he takes various things that exist in an institution and puts them together in ways that they never would be together to talk about race and violence and history. And actually, at the Kerry James Marshall show that I saw in New York, part of the reason I wanted to see it in New York, because it also came to LA, and it's, I think there now, and it's a phenomenal show. If you have a chance to go down to LA to see it, please do. But part of the reason I flew all the way back to New York to go see it is because he was invited to choose 40 works from the Met's archive that he hung in a room a little bit, maybe twice as big as this room. Only 2 walls were hung, so it was like a gallery or a galley of work that has influenced him, and it was phenomenal. There was like a Balthus painting. There was an Ang, like a gray scale study. There were some sculptures from indigenous people in Africa, and to see this collection of things outside of the narrative of sort of like the march of time or the connection of subject matter or place, what I just think is so powerful, and again brings me back to that idea of like the grouping of things, while totally understandable because we have to make sense of the world, it occludes sometimes the specificities or the unexpected connections that can happen between things. So that's my diatribe. So back to this painting. Morris Graves, again, I didn't do research on the artist, but I know just very generally that he's from the Pacific Northwest. And he was born actually in 1910, which is 5 years after Bouguereau died, which I think is really interesting. And he died in 2001. So Bouguereau lived like 19th century, Morris Graves lived like the 20th century. And I know that I think that he was he was born into a very working class family, and in the later part of his life, he became a very devout Buddhist. That's kind of what I know of his biography, and then I know some of his paintings. The museum, I believe, has 3 on display. I don't know if they have more in the archives, but, and this is by far the one I'm most drawn to of the ones that I know or have seen on display. What do I like about this piece? And you guys, I'm not going to talk for very much longer because you're probably getting tired of listening to me talk about my thoughts about paintings. But so I recognize this place. I've been to places like this. It reminds me of some places in like in the foothills of dry mountains in eastern Nevada, mining towns that are dead or dying. And so I can sort of project my own experience into this place. And more than that, I mean, it's so striking in its darkness. We have, the palette is really pretty much gray and brown, and then there's a little bit of green here, and the green, of course, in the flower. And this juxtaposition between what's happening in the landscape and the flower is also, or the vase of flowers, is really super striking to me. The sort of desolation of the scene, and then this flower placed, foregrounded in that desolation. And in terms of technique, you could get further apart than Bouguereau and Morris, but I'd say they're pretty darn far apart. And so I think it's really interesting to consider them together, because they're about 50 years apart from each other, which blows my mind. So I think the message of this piece is interesting. there's definitely a sense of doom and gloom, like big time, right? I mean, this is a dead or dying town, and there's ruination, and I get the sense that Graves sees that sort of desolation as very much caused by humanity, and so he's implicating us and sort of throwing that in our faces. But then there's not rancor in that, and I feel like this gesture of placing this, the flower here in the foreground of this incredibly desolate, dark, full of doom, ominous scene is a very unexpected gesture, and to me, it holds a lot of tenderness, and I find that surprising. It's a surprising response to what's going on here. And it also, because of the murkiness of the palette and the sort of the way that the brushstrokes are, things go into each other, the painting kind of, I don't know, the way that I encounter it is kind of like almost like a fog clearing, which is very different than my experience of encountering the Bouguereau, which was more like kind of a, like I said, a reverie. And this feels, if I were to put a word to this, my experience of viewing this painting, it would be perhaps an epiphany, where something sort of appears to you suddenly after sort of a long contemplation. I also think it's really interesting that this painting does not have a human form in it. The human body is implicated in the buildings. We occupy buildings. It's implicated in the graves where bodies are laid to rest. But what stands in for the figure in this painting is the vase of flowers. And I think it's really interesting to implicate the human body. I mean, I think the human body is always implicated in paintings because the viewer is there. Otherwise, the painting wouldn't exist, consciously. But I think it's really interesting to implicate the human body, but withhold the human body. And what that maybe allows for in terms of a relationship with the painting is very different than when there's a body there that kind of pushes itself outward towards us. Yeah, and so, but when I think about these two pieces together, it's interesting, in terms of similarities, they're both set in nature. They both have an offering set in nature. I think in the Bouguereau painting, the child itself is the offering. And that offering signifies a kind of ease, maybe a kind of purity, you could say. And I think that sets up an interesting ideal of maybe an unreachable ideal, the ideal of purity, or that kind of like purity being aligned with that which is unsullied or new, because that's never where we find ourselves. And in Graves, again, there is this offering, but there's none of this sort of bucolic or ideal presented. He's not glossing over suffering. He's actually like kind of, giving it to us as forcefully as he can, and implicating humanity in that. But yet, there's not a violence in that gesture, because he shows us what he sees. Maybe he shows us his sorrow, or he shows us his hopelessness, or he shows us his despair. But then what he offers to us is flowers in response to that. And I can't help but think about his growth into practicing Buddhism, and which is predicated on acceptance and compassion. So that's where I'll end, and I'm happy to answer questions, and also if you guys want to sort of get up and if you're tired of listening or talking.
It's interesting in terms of the juxtaposition of the paintings, and also kind of like the religious theme. It's interesting. So you know he was a Buddhist or practicing a Buddhist?
In his later life.
Yeah, because if you were to look at the last one, you could almost draw out a religious theme with the Trinity and almost the Christ child kind of view here, and almost like when you say kind of an epiphany, you could almost see, as if there's the resurrection or the cross bearing there with the flower, and the flower almost in deposition.
Yeah, but I think that I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is religious, like Christian religious undertones in the Bouguereau for sure, and I mean, Graves was an American, and I think he was actually named for his parents' Methodist minister, or their minister or something. So he grew up with religion, I'm sure, but I see a different relationship to idealization and suffering and redemption and those sorts of themes of Christianity. I see a different relationship to those ideas here than I do in the Bouguereau. Yeah. Any other questions?
Can you speak about this piece in context to your work a little bit?
Oh, sure. I have an image of this in my studio, sort of like I have a desk that I sit at sometimes to work, and it's right where I can see it there. So I look at it often. It feels very distant in terms of. Do you guys have to go? Bye. Thanks for coming. Bye. It feels distant in terms of maybe. Definitely in terms of subject matter. I don't deal with landscape. The approach feels the relationship to materials feels very distant. Sometimes I wish that I could paint like this, like I have like a sort of like a attraction repulsion relationship to this kind of painting. Like sometimes I come to it and I'm like, oh my God, that's so like energetic and free, and then sometimes I'm just like, oh God, like it's so repulsive, like there's not enough craft in it, but I'd say that but I have it at my desk where I look at it a lot, and I think that I think what resonates with me is how, when I look at his paintings, how I feel like he's putting so much of himself and like his own questioning of his experience and like the nature of existence, and how that manifests like through his daily life and experience. I feel like he does that so deeply, and that's very inspiring to me.
I see it like I can see this piece as an element in one of your pieces.
Yeah, that's a good. I could get away with like being grotesque. In one corner. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you.